The UK Supreme Court is hearing arguments regarding Prime Minister Boris Johnson's controversial suspension of Parliament. Britain's top court will determine if Mr Johnson acted unlawfully in advising the Queen to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks in a bid to force through a no-deal Brexit.
We say it is an improper purpose for the Prime Minister to use the power of prorogation because he wants to avoid the risk of Parliament undermining the policies of the executive during the relevant period.
MPs will only return on October 14th, while Britain is due to leave the European Union on the 31st of October. Last week, Scotland's highest court concluded that the shutdown was unlawful, while London's High Court disagreed.
For the latest on this, Ollie Barrett joins us from London. Ollie, what can you tell us about the ongoing hearing?
Well, so far we have been hearing from Lord Pannick, who is one of the lead lawyers bringing this case to the Supreme Court, arguing that in his belief and in the belief of his team, that Boris Johnson's suspension of Parliament was unlawful, and he's been making a series of key arguments. He's been suggesting to the judges at the Supreme Court that prorogation, crucially, Lord Pannick believes is a matter for the Supreme Court. The decision that came down earlier from the High Court in London suggested that this wasn't a matter for the judiciary and was political. Lord Pannick also saying that he believes the Prime Minister's been using this suspension, this prorogation of Parliament to avoid scrutiny. Also saying that the Prime Minister should have offered, in his view, and the view of his legal team, a witness statement to the Supreme Court to explain exactly the advice that the Prime Minister gave to the Queen about suspending Parliament. And as I say, the thrust of all of this, the argument from Lord Pannick, who is one of the legal teams for one of the cases that has wound up in the Supreme Court, is that prorogation is unlawful. Well, we will hear later on in this case from the government's lawyers, and they will dispute all of that. They will say that all of that is misleading and that this case should be thrown out, and that the High Court in London got this one right all along. But it is a huge decision that the Supreme Court is making, with profound implications for Boris Johnson and his government, but also for the UK's unwritten constitution as well.
All right, so let's talk about the possible outcomes then. So what will happen to Prime Minister Johnson if the court decides that the suspension of Parliament is illegal?
First of all, it would be deeply embarrassing for him. It would be a huge hiccup for his government. Certainly, if the judges not only rule that prorogation is unlawful, but also give some credence to that idea that Boris Johnson misled the Queen with his advice to her when he advised her to suspend Parliament, that would be potentially deeply damaging for Boris Johnson as well. The British public, you would think, would be unlikely to be too keen on the idea of a Prime Minister misleading the Queen. Boris Johnson, of course, denies that that is what he did at all. There would certainly at that point be calls for his resignation. You would expect that he would try and resist those calls. And it would probably mean that Boris Johnson's government would have to recall Parliament slightly earlier than planned. Now, we are in the party conference season anyway, so at this time, MPs are not at Parliament for much of this period of the UK year anyway, because the Liberal Democrats are having their conference this week, the Conservatives and the Labour Party have theirs to come as well. So it would probably mean in practical terms that Parliament gets back to work a few days earlier than that current scheduled date of October the 14th. So in terms of logistics, it may not mean a huge amount, but in terms of symbolism and in terms of the potential effect on Boris Johnson's reputation, as I say, it could be huge.
All right, thanks for that. Ollie Barrett speaking to us from London.